Hello and welcome to my easy to understand guide to the Daily Mirror set cover and double page article for examination from 2021 onwards in the Eduqas A-Level Media Studies exam specification. This is the set cover about Theresa May and Brexit. So this is only relevant if you're studying this exam from 2021 onwards, and I do have another video for the Times set cover as well. Now this set cover will only ever specifically appear in the A-Level Media Studies Eduqas exam as a Section A representation question in comparison to an unseen text that the exam board may give you in the exam. Newspapers in general could come up in Section B, where you might be asked about the Daily Mirror as a company and the kind of company behind it alongside the Times and the company behind that. And you may get an unseen newspaper cover for a media language question, but this particular Theresa May set cover will only ever appear specifically as a representation comparison question. Don't forget there is also an article attached to this cover as well. There is a double page article for this too, and that could also come up as a set question in comparison to something else. So we're going to be going through that in this exam video as well. But yeah, please do not forget about the double page article because it's something that some schools forget to teach, and actually it is part of the specification. So this is a picture of the double page article and we'll be going through that as well. But we'll start with the front cover. So it's important when you're thinking about representation questions to think about what could come up in the exam. Now, if I was an examiner, I would be thinking about maybe asking questions about representation of Theresa May in comparison to another product, representation of politicians or prime ministers, representation of kind of Brexit or this particular issue about Brexit, or representation of gender maybe also could be a good one to look at as well. So it's good to understand kind of a whole variety of issues to do with representation and this newspaper cover. So on the front cover, it's worth having a look at the small amount of space dedicated to this particular issue. The whole top of the page is about horse racing and betting and about celebrities and TV programmes. And then you've got an advert at the bottom of the page for kind of betting as well. And then you've got this small space given across to this issue. And have a think about how that represents the issue. It kind of makes it seem perhaps less important than perhaps as it could be. If it had taken up the whole cover, it might seem more serious. But taking up almost maybe a third of this cover, it does make the issue seem perhaps less serious than it could be. Tied into that, you've got to think about the size of Theresa May in the photo. She's just pictured in a very small photo, and that kind of makes her seem quite insignificant and weak. And think about how that ties into things like gender representations, women often seen as weaker, more vulnerable, less competent. So making her seem quite small and insignificant in this. And I suppose that might tie into the Daily Mirror's political stance. They are a left-wing paper, they are anti-conservative, and therefore they are quite traditionally against Theresa May and the rest of the Conservative Party. It also might reflect the fact that the target audience of the Daily Mirror is mostly men, and perhaps they might be more likely to see women as weaker and less competent, particularly in positions of power. Although she's not sexualised, which challenges that part of Van Zoonen's theory. She often says that women are sexualised, and many tabloid newspapers have sexualised her in the past, but this particular Daily Mirror cover does not, and that might tie into the fact that this is quite a serious issue. There's a lot of very negative, emotive language on this front cover that really represents Theresa May as being somebody that has failed. In fact, there's a lot of words that connote failure on this front cover. So if you have a look, you see the word loses. And then in the subheading, you can see the words surrenders and defeat. So all of these words are about loss and failure. And so really connoting this idea that Theresa May has not done a very good job. The word mayhem obviously is a clever pun on Theresa May's name, kind of means chaos, and actually we see the word chaos in the subheading again, and it's this idea that she's caused this mayhem, that there's a lot of chaos, that she's out of control, and that again she's not done a very good job. In the kind of lead intro paragraph that we get in this front cover, again, there's lots of words. They talk about her humiliating defeat. Describing something as humiliating is a way of embarrassing her and making it seem as though she should be embarrassed by something that she's done. It describes her authority as being in tatters. which kind of makes it seem as though it's been destroyed. She has no authority anymore. It's kind of ripped apart. This word tatters is kind of like ripped and torn. So they're using very emotive language to make it seem as though she has failed in her job, and as though this is, she's at kind of at rock bottom in terms of what she's achieved or not achieved, as the Daily Mirror seems to be suggesting. If you wanted to talk about gender in a more general way as well, you could have a look at the little EastEnders part at the very top of the newspaper cover. They're talking about a woman being glassed in EastEnders. And so it's this idea of, again, seeing perhaps women as being victimised, which is quite a big gender stereotype. And we're seeing a male jockey on a horse underneath, looking quite physically strong, quite physically capable, and that's perhaps a way of representing men in a more stereotypical way. So there's quite a few gender stereotypes going on here on this front cover. The image they've chosen of Theresa May, as well as being small, is also, particularly unflattering as well. Her head is kind of bowed down, which is a kind of sign of defeat as well. And it looks as though she's not just bowing her head down, but she kind of looks very disgruntled and maybe upset or annoyed, which again kind of connotes this idea that she's ashamed or that she's failed. So moving on to the double-page article that comes along with the Daily Mirror. The double-page article is again about Theresa May, so it's following on from the story that is on that front cover, and it's connoting the same ideas about defeat and failure and negativity surrounding Theresa May and what she's achieved. So the first thing you might notice is the big image of her in her red suit. That might be representing her as quite powerful. Red is quite a strong, bold colour, and the suit as well is kind of quite middle to upper class looking. So perhaps fits in with this idea of her being in a position of power, which kind of goes along, I guess, with her role as Prime Minister. But her hands are up like this. Now, if you put your hands up like this, it's kind of like this idea of, surrender or defeat. You're trying to defend yourself from somebody. So it's almost like she's trying to calm people down. And so it's this kind of, again, this image of surrender and not being in control of other people. And they use this headline, a faller at second. Now, you need to understand what this means because it's kind of terminology that I think a lot of you may not understand. It's a horse racing kind of metaphor or allegory. In horse racing, they have different jumps that horses have to go over, and they call them like the first jump, the second jump, the third jump. So when they say a faller at second, they normally mean a horse that has started out a race and fallen quite early on. So they have failed, they've not won, and they've fallen down quite early on. So they're using this as a metaphor for her failure quite early on in her prime ministerial career. So the use of this kind of horse imagery, as well as being quite dehumanising, they're literally comparing her to a horse. It's also this way, again, of connoting failure. There's a lot of quotes from other MPs about how Theresa May is losing, is in defeat, has caused chaos, has ruined the country. There are two smaller images of male politicians who I hope you recognise. You've got Boris Johnson, who is our current Prime Minister, in a small kind of circular graphic, and you've also got Jeremy Corbyn, who was the ex-leader of the Labour Party. He was the leader of the Labour Party at the time this article was published. And I suppose the idea is that these images, if you kind of look at it on the front cover, they're like staring at Theresa May. They've been positioned to look as though they're kind of looking down at her in dismay, like she's not doing a very good job. So their faces are pointing towards her. So it's this idea that she's being watched, that other male politicians are judging her. And I guess showing them in suits as being quite powerful. So perhaps this idea that Theresa May is under scrutiny by other MPs, both Labour and Conservative. The issue is quite a complicated one, but because this is a tabloid newspaper and the general readers have a reasonably low education and reading level, they've had to try and explain or represent the issue in a reasonably simple and easy to understand way. So there's lots of chunks of text, lots of subheadings, lots of graphics. use of statistics, and they've done this to try and make it easy to understand. And there's some binary opposites in this that you might need to be aware of. Don't forget, a lot of the readers of the Daily Mirror are quite working class. They really don't feel much connection with MPs. They feel as though it's almost like MPs over there and then working class normal people over here. And there is this kind of us versus them binary opposite in this article. So you have the kind of MPs across the top of the newspaper, a double page spread. And then at the bottom, you've got this idea of somebody called Honest Jason, who is the Daily Mirror's reporter, but he's like a betting reporter. But he's being represented as like the honest one, and he's giving you or giving the reader a kind of easy to understand betting analogy about how to understand this. So perhaps representing kind of average people as needing that simpler understanding and not being connected, not being part of MP's world, being very different to them and not being able to empathise or understand them very much. During her speech, which is kind of what they're reporting on, she had a really sore throat, so she was talking in a very kind of raspy way, and they actually openly mock her in the kind of side column on the left. The reporter there talks about how it sounded like there was a hamster inside of her trying to claw its way out. So kind of making fun of her and kind of making these silly stories up. Again, it's kind of quite silly and funny, which appeals to the target audience of the Daily Mirror, but it's also making her seem silly as well. And it's worth picking out some language from that double page article. They talk about her foolishly squandering her power. There's a lot of language again about loss and defeat. So maybe picking out a few quotes from the article that again show her as being quite negative and show her as having failed in her objective. Although the representations of women could be seen as them being victimised or seen as vulnerable or failing and not competent, some audiences might interpret these representations differently. You know, Theresa May does look quite powerful and strong in the double page article. She takes up a lot of space. Maybe it looks as though she's got things under control. And the article isn't all negative. They do talk a lot about how Brexit in general is a bit of a shambles. And so it does imply that perhaps this isn't all her fault, which is quite unusual for the Daily Mirror because they really are very anti-conservative normally. And the front page where you see the EastEnders character saying that she's been glassed, her facial expression doesn't look, hugely scared. She looks quite defiant. And so there are some mixed representations of gender on this. And, perhaps it's because although the Daily Mirror's readers are majority men, the majority is only just. It's really pretty even. So perhaps they are trying to appeal to a kind of mixed demographic in terms of gender of their audience. So that was my easy to understand guide to the Daily Mirror set cover and double page article for the 2021 examination onwards. I do have another video for the Times set cover as well, so please make sure you check that one out if you are studying that too.